And there we go. Right, okay, it's good. Pin the speaker. Okay. So, welcome everyone to our guest speakers, Rabbi Garry, Wayland. All know, one of our regulars. Thank you so much for joining us. And without further ado, I will call our speaker to say a few words.
Happy Hanukkah, everyone. It's lovely to be back at one of the breakfasts and learns, and Steve's always very fun to sort of fit it in around the school holidays. So helps me, so it keeps an eye on the school calendar and helps me as soon as I'm going to be off. But it's lovely, really. So the features or lack of features of Hanukkah is that we don't have a book that we read. And there's no specific text that we read over the course of Hanukkah. So in the mornings, we read of the Nisim, we read of the princes that we brought out in the desert. So we read those, and then on the day we catch up the final few of them. On Shabbos we have the Haftarah, which is the Haftarah by Zechariah, which is the vision of the menorah, which is a fascinating fascinating share, that one, but sort of pay attention to that one on Shabbos. It's most, some of the most beautiful lines. It's very cryptic as well, very, very difficult, but there's no sort of central text to Hanukkah. Obviously we've got Matzah, we've got Hanar Zalalu, but there's nothing sort of specifically that we read, which is interesting because we actually have kind of two books of Hashmonaim, the Maccabees. Okay, so it's interesting. If you look in, they're not included in scripture, but there are two books written from the time periods. There's a few more actually as well, but there's sort of two main books which deal with the Maccabee periods. Funnily enough, they're called Maccabees 1, Maccabees 2. And they sort of date from the time period. And the question that we're going to deal with in a couple of minutes is that, okay, so why don't we read them? Why are they sort of not part of our canon? Why are they not part of Tanakh? There's kind of a simple answer and there's a slightly more profound answer. So hopefully we'll pick up on those. But so again, we've got these two books. They're now much more accessible online because of sort of online things such as Sefaria and things like that. So if you can go and read them. I don't know if anyone sort of has read through them. They're quite long, quite detailed. They don't make much of an emphasis of sort of miracles per se, which is perhaps one of the reasons why they weren't included. But there are two of them. I think one was originally written. We know one was written originally in Hebrew. One was written in Greek, I think, originally. And sort of they go through the details of the battles of the Hashmonaim and sort of how they, how it kicked off and how it spread. And as I said, there's two of them. There's another couple, but they're kind of a similar time period. So the question is that why don't we read them? I think a very, very simple answer is because they're quite dry. But sort of slightly deeper answer is that there's why don't we actually have a book that we read on Hanukkah? Okay. Any thoughts? Anyone heard any answers on this one? Sorry. Apart from Rabbi Shissa, who I'm sure was there. Okay, so very simple answer, very, very simple answer, which really kind of strengthens the question, which is that there's a key requirement for being a book of Tanakh. Okay, it's a key requirement, very, very simple one, which is that it has to have been written by a prophet. So all of the books of the prophets, all of the books of the writings were written by prophecy. They weren't just people's recollections. They were people's writings. In the case of the books of writings, they were written by divine inspiration. So that doesn't mean that anyone who God spoke to automatically wrote a book that was included in Tanakh. So if you look through, for example, the book of Shmuel, right? The book of Shmuel speaks about prophets, and we see a few times that Shaul, the King Saul, goes and speaks with groups of prophets. We don't know who they are; they were nameless. But King Saul speaks with them, communicates with them, and it's clear that there was this group of prophets that was following Samuel. So, in ancient times, there were lots of prophets. Some of them might have been sort of speaking to their town. Some of them might have had sort of missions that we don't know about. Some of them might have just been almost communities, let's say, of hermits isn't necessarily the right word, but people who sort of lived in communities and tried to communicate with God and sort of spend their time engaged in spiritual practices. So kind of, when you read through the book of Saul, it might be those types of people that can very sort of, they were interested in communicating with God, but they didn't necessarily reach out to the people. So a key part of, sort of anything that we have in the book of Tanakh, it was written by a prophet. It was written by divine inspiration. So if you crack open sort of the words of Mishlei, they were written, according to our tradition, by Shlomo HaMelech. If you open, sort of any of the other books of, sort of Divrei HaYamim, which is I suppose Divrei HaYamim Chronicles, which is the final book of Tanakh, which is a Chronicles. It's the history of, really up to including King David. So tradition ascribes that to King Hezekiah. Very I think so. So really prophecy ended prior to the time of the Hanukkah miracle. So the last prophet we have was the prophet Malachi, who was in the times of Ezra, sort of so at the beginning of the building of the second period. So this was a sort of 150 years or so before the slightly longer, sorry, but before, sort of a good couple of 100 years before the Hanukkah miracle. So prophecy had ended by that time, right? So real reason, some simple reason, why weren't these two books included in Tanakh? Why do we not read them? And the answer is because they weren't written as holy books. They weren't written by prophecy. They were written, by people who lived at the time. They were inspired. They were historical. They were written by people who God did miracles for. Whether the military or the miracle of the oil. And so God did miracles, but they weren't writing as prophets. Okay, so that's kind of I suppose the historical background and the simple answer. So one of the thinkers who is sort of influenced me greatly was someone called Rabbi Yitzchak Huttner. And so Rav Huttner, his last night was a few days ago, last week. He was a Rosh Hashiva in America for most of his life. He died in 1985, I think. He spent his last years in Israel. And I've ever been to Harnof, sort of the suburb of Jerusalem, Harnof. At the very sort of top of Harnof, there's a yeshiva there which he founded. I think it was 1975. He was actually became international news because he was on an airplane that was taken that was hijacked by the Black September people in 1973, something like that. But he was one of the hostages there. And sort of once they found out that they had a very prominent rabbi on board, it kind of changed the negotiations, and eventually they, whatever, it sort of changed the nature of it because they became more worried for him as a high profile. Apparently, the story goes that when he was taken hostage, they offered, once they realised that they had sort of this important rabbi on board, they offered him a drink. And they offered him a Diet Coke, and he refused it on the grounds that it wasn't cold. So that was his line back to the terrorists. So they offered him a Diet Coke. He said, "No, I only drink my Diet Coke cold." That was one of his lines back to the terrorists. Sort of kept his cool and his wit in those situations. He was a very profound thinker, a very, very deep thinker, and so he says as follows. So the question is that why do we have a festival? And why do we have a festival which is written, I suppose, after the close of prophecy? Why do we have a whole festival? There's no books, there's no holy books, there's no prophets, there's no inspired books. So why is this? Why do we have this festival? Okay, so the question is, why is this Hanukkah exist? Why do we have a book that wasn't written by divine inspiration? Why do we have a festival which wasn't inspired by the prophets? He sort of writes a whole long explanation, but he bounces off of the line that we conclude Mark solely. Right, so there's some beautiful, profound words. As Egmore, so then I will complete the shir with a song over Mizmor and a song, another type of song. The difference between them we'll say for another time. And I will complete with them with the song and with poems. Chanukah Samizbech, the dedication of the altar. So it says Rabbi that the emphasis, most of our festivals, is about tapping into the gifts or the miracles that God has done for us. So Hanukkah, we remember the kindnesses that God did to us when, Pesach, when God took us out of Egypt. On Shavuos, we remember that God gave us the Torah. The book Purim, the book of Esther, we remember, the fact that God did a miracle for us, through Esther and through Mordecai. But with Hanukkah, it's almost the opposite. So all other festivals and mitzvot is really from above to below. That God did a miracle, which we then commemorate, we relive, and we reenact. But the emphasis on Hanukkah is as the words of my Surah say, "Az egmor," that really it's up to me to complete the job. That God took us, sort of through how many thousands of years of history with miracles, with prophecy. But God at a point said, you know what, that sort of my direct communication with God is going to stop, and then it's going to be Az egmor, that we finish the job. And so specifically, that's why Hanukkah came as a miracle, or came as a festival after the cessation of prophecy, because really it's kind of the first miracle, the first it's the festival that we have. It's coming from below rather than coming from above, and it's us sort of taking the baton that God has provided to us. And specifically, Raphael says it's kind of the darkest point of the night. It's the darkest point of the winter. The days are very short. It's extremely dark outside, and so that's sort of very symbolic. Yeah, when the world is at its darkest, that's when we light the candles, and that's when sort of we carry on the divine sparks that God has gave us. It's a brief thought on a sort of very profound idea of
now, or did it have in greater prominence? Well, now, the last few hundred years as opposed to 10.
So it's described as being very precious back in 1,000 years ago. In the Gemara, it's clear, it's got a very high place, and it's sort of put on par with mitzvahs of Shabbos candles in various places. Sort of it's linked together. Prominence is an interesting word. It's become much more public. I think in recent decades. I think the nature of it has changed. The way that we celebrate it becomes sort of, I suppose, much more of an interface between sort of, and almost, it's the liminal space, it's the doorpost, it's the edge of the Jewish world and the non-Jewish world, and it's kind of very much navigating that. But again, that's for a different time. I do, I'm afraid, so we have to.
Of the prophets.
The book of Esther doesn't have prophecy in it per se, but in terms of where it fits in the canon, it would have been in the same time period as who more actually says that there's the prophet Malachi, who we have got a short book of prophecy from, is the same as Mordecai did, and how all of the canon fits together is a separate share.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Rabbi Garry Wayland. Very interesting theme about Hanukkah. Just to say that next week we do have Breakfast and Learn on Tuesday. But Tuesday next week is the additional bank holiday, next to the Christmas bank holiday. So we will be starting half an hour later next week. We're doubling at 8:30, so the show will be about 9:15 next week. For those overseas on Zoom, it'll be half an hour later next week. Okay, I'll say goodbye to those on Zoom. Have a happy Hanukkah, and I'll do the bracha achrona. Okay.